Let's move on to the subject now of pre-settlement statuses. So let's assume that our situation is that we issued a trade confirmation, that we know that the counterparty has agreed it, we've issued a settlement instruction to the custodian, and now we are eager to hear back from the custodian what the status is, whether it's matched or unmatched. So a pre-settlement status is a condition that's applied to a settlement instruction by a CSD or a custodian, depends who you're using specifically, which reflects the matched status of your instruction. Of course, we need the instruction to be matched because it has to be matched prior to settlement. How are such statuses derived? So following receipt of a settlement instruction, the custodian attempts to match the investment bank's instruction with the counterparty's instruction. The possible statuses are that it is matched. Now, so within the heading of match then, can you have different levels? Well, yes. You can have this level, which is the details of your instruction and your counterparty's instruction match perfectly in all respects, inclusive of the cash figure, the cash settlement amount. But you can also have, or instead have this status, that all details match apart from the cash value, but there is a difference which is within a tolerance. Now that tolerance is set by the CSD. Now in the case of Euroclear in Brussels, that tolerance is $25 US. So in all other respects, the details of the settlement instructions between the two parties must be the same, apart from the cash value, which can be different by up to $25 US or currency equivalent of that amount. So if you've got a difference of $12 US, then it will be regarded as matched. On the other hand, your status would be unmatched if all details match apart from the cash value, and if the monetary amount is more than $25 or currency equivalent, or you've got completely missing instructions from the counterparty. So this would be a situation where you have issued your settlement instruction, there is no matching, there is no equivalent instruction, let's say yet at least, from the counterparty. And advisory or alleged is the other way round, where actually you haven't issued an instruction, that there is a party, potentially a counterparty, that's issued an instruction which is alleging the trade against one of your accounts. And it remains to be seen whether you recognise that trade or not. So obviously this is the status that you want matched, but you could find some of your instructions are unmatched, and you may have some of these as well, preferably a limited number of these. Okay, so the possible statuses then. Let's use this chart to identify what the possible statuses can be. Right, so just to explain the basics of the diagram, here is trade date, and we're assuming T+3 value date. So this is the date. This is the all-important date here, value date. And the dates in between trade date and value date are represented by value date -2, value date -1 before you reach value date, and we also go beyond value date as well. So, and here are the possible statuses: unmatched, matched, settled and failed. So just to explain, if you visualize a situation where we have executed a trade and now we have issued a settlement instruction. So if today's the trade date, we've issued a settlement instruction, and our instruction we know has been successfully received by the CSD that we're using. If there is no matching instruction by the counterparty, from the counterparty, then our instruction will be given a status of UNM, meaning unmatched, with a priority of 2. Unmatched, hopefully you can see that that makes sense. Why a priority of 2? Because it's not as urgent as a priority of 1 and it being unmatched, and that's because of the number of days it is away from the value date. So it's a priority of 2. Now, if trade date is today, we've issued an instruction, it could be this morning that it is UNM2, but later on that day the counterparty issues an instruction and there are a number of attempts by the CSD to match our instructions intraday. If the CSD then discovers that there is now an instruction from the counterparty, and if it matches, then our instruction will be given a status of FUT, which means matched with a future value date. So that's the maximum status that we can get before value date. Now, it can't have settled yet, and it can't have failed, because the earliest point that settlement or failure can occur is the value date. Okay, so if today we've executed the trade, we've issued an instruction, it's unmatched, and it's still unmatched tomorrow, it will retain the same status, UNM with a priority of 2. If later on that day the counterparty inputs an instruction, then it will go to FUT, not applicable, not applicable. If, though, we now get to value date -1, and if our instruction is in with the CSD, but there is still no matching instruction from the counterparty, it will still be UNM, but now the priority moves up to UNM1, otherwise known as urgent unmatched. So now this is getting particularly worrying, because value date is the next day, and even though it won't be our fault if settlement failure occurs because of a lack of matching, we're likely to go to the trouble to pick the phone up to the counterparty and say, what's happening with your instruction? And hopefully they'll say, we are inputting it now, and that could then result in us achieving that. It still, though, cannot settle and it cannot fail because it's before value date, the important date here. Okay, so if it was unmatched right the way up to here, and now we reach value date, and if it's still unmatched on value date, it will retain the status of unmatched with a priority of 1. So you cannot get an unmatched status with a greater priority than 1. But that, if you get that, it means that the trade is failing. It's already failing. Now, on this row here, matched, it's not applicable now. Why? Because we've reached value date, and on that date, if you have matched instructions, then it will either settle or it will fail to settle. Okay, if it fails to settle, here these are known as reason codes. So what does CSEC mean? This means that the C, that's counterparty, is insufficient of securities. So that means that we would be buying. The reason for failure to settle is because the counterparty cannot deliver the securities. Just to be clear, you would only get that. You'd only get these statuses, these fail reasons, if you have matched instructions. If you don't have matched instructions, it will remain like that, which means that it cannot settle until a match has occurred. So CSEC means the counterparty is insufficient of securities. USEC means that that's we, are insufficient. So this means we are selling. We don't have adequate quantity of securities to deliver. That's the reason why settlement is failing. Okay, so these two failed statuses here are securities related. That means the seller is insufficient of securities. Of course, we could be the seller or the buyer, depending upon which way round the trade has been executed. And these two statuses here relate to the cash. The sequence that the CSD operates in, if I'm the CSD and here's the seller and here's the buyer and there are matched instructions between them, the first thing on value date I will do is to ask the question, does the seller have an adequate quantity of securities? And if the answer is yes, then I'll look at the buyer's account and ask the question whether the buyer has adequate amount of cash to pay. The answer could be yes there as well, in which case I will allow settlement to occur. But going back to this, if I ask the question, has the seller got adequate quantity of securities to deliver? If the answer is no, then clearly there's no point in looking to the buyer, because I'm not going to allow settlement to occur if the seller does not have sufficient quantity of securities. So therefore it's sequential. So in other words then, these two statuses here of OTH and PROV. OTH means your counterparty cannot pay. And you'd only get that status if you as a seller were able to deliver securities. And PROV is the other way round, which is that you are insufficient of cash. This means that the counterparty is able to deliver securities, but you cannot pay. So these statuses have real meaning and should really be used actively and proactively by the party that receives such statuses. And just lastly on this diagram, if we look at value date +1, if your instruction was unmatched on value date and it's not been matched since, then it will retain a status of UNM1. So now this is really costing somebody money now if you reach this situation. But you can still have settlements occurring on value date +1 and beyond, and you can still have failure occurring on value date +1 and beyond as well. So anything which is unmatched we need to give focus to, and anything which is failing we also need to give focus to. In some cases those failed statuses are bad news for us, particularly when selling. If you can't settle a sale, it means you're not going to be receiving cash. But there are cases that where you're buying and the seller cannot deliver to you, then that is actually an opportunity to make more money unexpectedly, because you're simply not having to pay on value date.